Namaskar. This is the fifth session on the scientific heritage of India. Earlier, we looked at the science per se, and to some extent, even the technology of India during the 17th and 18th centuries. That is, before the advent of the East India Company. East India Company started ruling in 1757 from Bengal. And slowly they expanded and covered the whole of India, or at least their control was over the whole of India, directly or indirectly, by around 1803. So after that, for about 150 years, India had to bear the British rule, and during which so many things have happened. And one of the things is that our science and technology, which was prevalent in Indian society until then, kind of atrophied. It died. It went under, and we lost it almost for good. So Sri Dharmapal made a concerted effort to understand the nature and polity of Indian society before the advent of the British. These findings, this research were published in 5 different volumes, compiled and published by the Other India bookstore. So one of them is on the science and technology during the 18th century, specifically focusing on science and technology during the 18th century. And we have been reviewing this book for the last 2 sessions. We will continue to do that and make closing remarks today. Today we will see 3 subsections. One is, why do we study history as per Sri Dharmapal? And then the victor and the vanquished, the relationship between the rulers and the ruled, and its impact on our society. And then finally, the conclusions. Sri Dharmapal ji is very clear on why we are making this study. He felt that unless we know our roots, we cannot build our future. So he says, since independence in 1947, it is this question of reconstruction of self and society on the foundation of our priorities, values, tradition, and culture that seems to have completely eluded us, particularly our scholars, administrators, and politicians. The leadership of the society is usually with this class of people who are middle and upper middle class. Generally, the leadership rests on them. In any society, it is so. And if this leadership is alienated from the roots of our society, naturally the superstructure that we build will not be according to our nature. We appear to have forgotten that we can look back and learn from our own past. And based on that experience, construct our own unique identity within the context of our own affairs as well as that of the rest of the world. Please note that he is talking about the paradigm. Our reconstruction, post-independence reconstruction has been modeled on the Western paradigm, more specifically on Russia, which is out and out a materialistic, mechanistic paradigm. Whereas our own paradigm we have studied is quite distinct and different. And therefore this graft did not work, does not work. What do we as a nation, without leaning on others' ideological and material crutches, want? Do we have ingenuity or not? Can we make our own points as against aligning with one sort or another? Do we have a point to make as Indians? The Western models are two. One is capitalistic model and another is the communist model, but both are based on materialist paradigm. India has a distinct paradigm and we need to look at that and understand. Says Sri Dharampal, today we feel encircled by hostility, much of it in fact generated by our own ineptitude and actions. From around 1947, we have treated ourselves as cousins of the West. Dominated by the West, it may be necessary at the moment to rely on Western knowledge and products. But this can only be a short-term proposal. Very soon, whatever Western know-how or products seem essential to us, we must learn to produce them in our own way, with our own material, variations and modifications. In the meantime, however, we must set our ordinary people free. See, this is a mental slavery which has not gone away even after independence. Sri Dharmapal makes a very concerted point, very pertinent point, that we must set our ordinary people free, recognize their genius, remove the obstacles in their path relating to the use of their local, physical and material resources, and encourage them to use their talents to rebuild their own shattered worlds in their own various ways. Even if required, by withdrawing those laws and rules, we tend to block whatever they attempt and keep our advice and criticism to ourselves. Set them free. They have an innate genius which will flower if you set them free. Only then can other local relationships and linkages begin to come alive. Societal manners and memory pertaining to specific activities begin to get awakened. And the rebuilding not remain a mere copy of the past. By taking account of the world around it, Indian society will begin to integrate such elements of Western or other technologies that seem to it as relevant and stimulating for its own base. When we build a future, it is not an exact replica of the past, our own past, or replica of the models which you are trying to copy. He says it should have a life of its own. It should choose its directions on its own and grow, but integrating all the relevant aspects of our past as well as the Western models. But it should be an integration, not a copy. For all this to happen, a profound alteration in our attitudes towards our people and our past has to take place. We must enable our people to feel more self-assured, confident, hopeful, proud of their talents and capacities, and encourage them to regain their individual and societal dignity. Dignity means self-respect. We should begin to be aware of the linkage of each and every locality with the immediate region, of the region with the country, and of our country with other countries on this earth, and the earth's linkage with the cosmos. Should recognize the natural linkages and allow them to flourish. A local action with a global vision, a cosmic vision. This has been the genius of India. If you look at the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna has a very temporal, local problem which surfaced on the spot. And he was overwhelmed by the problem. But if you look at Krishna's response, the response is cosmic. These efforts would require new texts of well-told stories of localities, regions, countries, the world, and the various ideas about the beginning or non-beginning of the universe. Such knowledge and awareness would make our people feel confident and well-informed, and also enable them to partake of the Indian understanding of life, of natural phenomena. It would also ground them in the elements of various sciences and technologies in agriculture, animal husbandry, forestry, and crafts, as well as in history, philosophy, grammar, and language. Thus, by about the age of 14, our children, boys as well as girls, would have become competent citizens of their respective areas. See the breadth of his vision. I would recommend a book by Dharmapal which talks about the Indian psyche, Bharatiya Chitta Manasa Aur Kala. That is the title of the book. It is the Indian psyche and Indian concept of time, the time scale with which India thinks. It is a very large time scale. Anything happens in India happens very slowly, but very decisively. Bharatiya Chitta Manasa Aur Kala, Indian psyche and its concept of time. This is Claude Alvarez, the one who published Sri Dharmapal's books in a compiled format. He's a writer and he wrote the introduction for this. I think he wrote the preface for these works. And he says, all histories are elaborate efforts at myth making. Therefore, when we submit to histories about us written by others, we submit to their myths about us as well. Myth making, like naming, is a token of having power. Submitting to others' myths about us is a sign that we are without power. If we must continue to live by myths, however, it is far better we choose to live by those of our own making rather than by those invented by others for their own purposes, whether English or Japanese. That much at least we owe ourselves as an independent society and nation. Now we look at another section where the Europeans during this period made certain observations about India and Indian science and technology in particular. I have a few quotations on that so that we see from which direction they are approaching and what are their prejudices and what are their purposes. This is Professor Playfair, a mathematician, who reviewed the knowledge accumulated in the European hands on Indian astronomy by 1792. That is the year when he reviewed this, he wrote these things. 1792, he reviewed many papers which have been accumulated on Indian astronomy. And this was published in the journal, Royal Asiatic Society Journal. And he makes these observations. We have seen several observations in our earlier sessions, several quotations from Professor Playfair. But about India, he says, among many subjects of wonder which the study of these ancient fragments cannot fail to suggest. He admits that there are many points which Indian astronomy makes. It is not one of the least that algebra has existed in India and has been cultivated for more than 1200 years without any significant improvement. He says that, yeah, it existed for 1200 years, but there is no improvement. It is stagnating. The point he's making is that Indian society as on today, that is 1792, has stagnated for several centuries without any signal improvement or the addition of any material discovery. The works of the ancient teachers of science have been commented on, elucidated, and explained with skill and learning, but no new methods have been invented, nor any new principle introduced. The method of resolving indeterminate problems. In algebra, we are talking about indeterminate equations of the first order, second order. Yeah, India has learned this method, propounded this method for quite some time, but nothing more, he says. The method of resolving indeterminate problems that constitute the highest merit of their analytical science were known to Brahmagupta hardly less accurately than to Bhaskara. There is a difference of about four centuries between Brahmagupta and Bhaskara. And they appear to have been understood even by Aryabhata, that is still earlier, more ancient by several centuries than either. But the society was stagnating. That was his point. This is the comment, this is the criticism we find even today. Indians often claim that we had a hoary past, great achievements, great learning, but nothing new. We have to take this criticism seriously and find an answer to this criticism. A long series of scholiasts, that is commentators, display in their annotations great acuteness, intelligence, and judgment, but they never pass far beyond the line drawn by their predecessors, which probably seemed, even to those learned and intelligent men, as the barrier within which it was to be confined. In India, indeed, everything seems equally insurmountable, and truth and error are equally assured of permanence in the stations they have been once occupied. The politics, the laws, the religion, the science, and the manners seem all nearly the same as at the remotest period to which history extends. Very serious and important commentary. Continues Professor Playfair, says, a commentary on the Vijaganita bearing the date of 1602 contains a full exposition of the sense with complete demonstrations of the rules, much in the manner of Ganesha. And there is a commentator of a still later date who appears to have flourished about the year 1621. If therefore it be true that the Hindus of the present time understand nothing of their scientific books, the decline of knowledge among them must have been very rapid, as it is plain that at the distance of less than 2 centuries from the present time, the light of science was shining in India with considerable luster. He is writing about 1792, he is talking about 1602. He says, yes, at that time, but after that, nothing. This is another of the commentators, another writers, Colebrooke, a very important writer, the first major Sanskrit scholar from Europe. He is writing in the year 1817, some 20 years later, 25 years later than Playfair. He listed several qualifications of Indian algebra. He said it is superior to either Egyptian or Greek algebra, that is European algebra. Certainly is superior, and he lists 1, 2, 3, 4 points why it is superior. But after that, you please observe his comment after that. First, let me read this. The points in which the Hindu algebra appears particularly distinguished from the Greek are, besides a better and more comprehensive algorithm, 4 other points is this. First, the management of equations involving more than one unknown term. 2, the resolution of equations of a higher order. 3, the general methods of solutions of indeterminate problems of the first and second degrees, in which they went far, indeed, beyond Diophantus, and anticipated discoveries of modern algebraists. 4th, application of algebra to astronomical investigation and geometrical demonstration, in which also they hit upon some matters which have been reinvented in later times. All these are positive, but then he makes another comment. After listing the merits of Indian Bijaganita, vis-a-vis Grecian algebra, Colebrooke could not resist tracing its origin to Grecian instructors. He says that the Grecian instructor did not have that mathematics, but then he says it originated there. He wrote that no doubt can be entertained that the Hindus received hints from the astronomical schools of the Greeks. How? On what basis does he say? He says there is no proof. That he also admits. It must then be admitted to be at least possible, if not probable, in the absence of direct evidence and positive proof. He doesn't have a proof for this claim, but yet he claims that the imperfect algebra of the Greeks, which had advanced in their hands no further than the solution of equations involving one unknown term, as it is taught by Diophantus, was made known to the Hindus by their Grecian instructors. Who are the Grecian instructors? We do not know. In fact, Pythagoras is said to be the student of Brahmana. He came to the east, or he learned from the east. But here he says Grecian instructors in improved astronomy. But by the ingenuity of the Hindu scholars, the hint was rendered fruitful, and the algebraic method was soon ripened from that slender beginning to the advanced state of a well-arranged science as it was taught by Aryabhata, and as it is found in the treatise compiled by Brahmagupta and Bhaskara. both of which versions are here presented to the public. This is the beginning of the 19th century, and this trend is visible among other scholars as well. Look at what Guthrie said. Guthrie was a cardiovascular surgeon who participated in the Battle of Waterloo in 1815 from the British side. He admired Indian surgery, but then offers a left-handed compliment and tries to connect it to the Greek origin. It was surgery above all that the ancient Hindus excelled. Sushruta described more than 100 instruments. This was their greatest contribution to the art of healing, and the work was bold and distinctive. It is not unlikely, though difficult to prove, he has no proof, though difficult to prove, that some of it were of Greek origin. Some indeed state that the Greek drew much of their knowledge from the Hindus. He has reasons to believe the other way. There are hints, clear indications, but then he says that it is from the Greek. This is 1815. This is with regard to science. Now I'm touching another domain. This is William Wilberforce. William Wilberforce was a British statesman, a politician, philanthropist, leader of the movement to abolish slave trade. Very powerful indeed in the early years of the 19th century. In 1813, William Wilberforce took it upon himself to get the approval of his parliament for the missionaries to convert Indians. He passed a bill, the parliament passed a bill, and he led that bill. So in his speech, he said, in the House of Commons, he said, "It has been truly remarked, particularly by the historian of America, that the moral character of a people may commonly be known from the nature and attributes of the objects of its worship. On this principle, we might have anticipated the moral condition of the Hindus by ascertaining the character of their deities. Truly may it be said, in the adventures of the countless rabble of Hindu deities," see the epithets he is using, "in the adventures of the countless rabble of Hindu deities, you may find every possible variety of every practicable crime. Every vice has its patron, as well as its example. Their divinities are absolute monsters of lust, injustice, wickedness, and cruelty. In short, their religious system is one of grand abomination." So he said India should be converted. But in order to say this, his argument is long. I'm not getting into that, but I'm saying the attitude of the British leadership at the beginning of the 19th century had substantially changed from the beginning of their rule. This is about 50 years after their rule. They had changed considerably. Initially, they wanted to know more about India. They advocated that the manuscripts available in India, especially in Banaras and other places, should be translated to English or European languages, through which we will advance our science, our technology, our polity, and our governance. That was the stand in 1783. But then, as years progressed, they set their roots in India. They started controlling the entire country. Then it is the attitude of the ruler, the victor against the vanquished. It started reflecting on every domain of life, not only science, not only technology, but also in religion and politics. This is Macaulay. Macaulay was the chairman of the Committee for Public Instruction, how the education is to be conducted in India. He was appointed the chairman by Lord Bentinck. And the committee had 10 members in addition to the chairman, Lord Macaulay. Macaulay is a very brilliant man, very good writer, very good poet. And he headed this committee and made a report. It's a 19-page report which you can download, available in certain digital libraries, in which that document is known as the Minute. He titled it as the Minute. It is not the minutes of the meeting, it is a report submitted by Macaulay to Lord Bentinck. And this is what he says. I have never found one among them, among the members of his committee, that is 10 members of his committee. I have never found one among them who would deny that a single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. See the sweeping statement. A single shelf of a good European library was worth the whole native literature of India and Arabia. The intrinsic superiority of the Western literature is indeed fully admitted by those members of the committee who support the Oriental plan of education. See, the committee had 10 members and it was divided equally. 5 members said the education should be in Sanskrit and Persian, and 5 members said that it should be in English. Macaulay sided the latter. Since it was equally divided, his vote became crucial and his opinion became the opinion of the committee. So he says that even those people who say that it should be taught in Sanskrit or Persian admit that there is no value in the literature of India or Arabia. And then he added, it will hardly be disputed, I suppose, that the department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest in poetry. What did the East contribute? It contributed literature. Maybe you have a Kalidasa who gave you a Shakuntala and that kind of work. So it is poetry, not sciences. Science is a contribution of Europe. That is his stand. The department of literature in which the Eastern writers stand highest is poetry, and I certainly never met with any Orientalist. Orientalist means the one who studied the East, Eastern philosophy or literature. With any Orientalist who ventured to maintain that the Arabic and Sanskrit poetry could be compared to that of the great European nations. They cannot be, he says. But when we pass from the works of imagination to the works in which facts are recorded, he's referring to the sciences. Literature, it is inferior. But about the sciences, he's talking about, where facts are recorded, sciences as well as history, the facts are recorded and general principles investigated. Obviously, he's talking about scientific investigation. The superiority of the Europeans becomes absolutely immeasurable. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say that all the historical information which has been collected from all the books written in the Sanskrit language is less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgment used at preparatory schools in England. See the contempt. In every branch of physical or moral philosophy, the relative position of the two nations is nearly the same. Sri Dharmapal writes, the tradition has in fact continued well into the present time. Macaulay's tradition has continued well into the present time. Only as time passed, however, it has become more and more Eurocentric. Eurocentric means Europe is superior, more and more Eurocentric. The late 19th century dictum that this is given by, the statement is made by Sir Henry Maine, who was a one-time law member of the Governor General's Council in India. He said, except the blind forces of nature, nothing moves in this world which is not Greek in its origin. He said the whole civilization, culture, and thought, leadership is given to the Greek. This statement is merely an intellectual and scholarly expression of the mounting Eurocentric character of this speculativeness. Notice the year, it is 1883 when he said this. So throughout the 19th century, this trend continued. It continued with the scholars, it continued with the missionaries, it continued with the politicians, it continued with the scientists and technologists. So by the end of 19th century, this contempt was complete. However, I would like to make this point here. This chart I have shown earlier also, but look at the thought leaders, the scientific leaders of India, scientist leaders of India. Bodhayan Acharya, Aryabhatta, Varahamihira, Bhaskara, and Madhavacharya. We have discussed each of them. Bodhayana belongs to a period, the Vedic period, that is earlier to 2000 BC. Aryabhatta around 500 AD. Varahamihira half a century later. Bhaskara to the 12th century. And Madhavacharya 14th century. 14th and 15th century. Yeah, 14th and 15th century. 1400, around that. The period is long. Nobody can say these are not original contributors. Professor Playfair notwithstanding, these are original contributors. There are no mathematicians comparable to Aryabhatta, Bhaskara, and Ramanuja in the whole world. But India did not contribute when Europe was active. Europe was active in the year, look at this, Copernicus, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, and Gregory. The year belonged to 1543, that is the beginning of the scientific revolution, and it goes until the end of 17th century. So something like 16th, 17th century, that is a period when the scientific revolution occurred. Of course, this contribution extended further. The West, of course, can boast of an Einstein. That is the close of 19th century, beginning of 20th century, or first half of 20th century, you can say. That is true, but this is the period when India was not very active, is true. India had gone under. See, no society can boast that it was active and contributing all the time. No society can boast that. India was not active here, but at the same time, you can also ask the question, why Europe was not active when India was? Why Europe was not active before 1500? For 1,000 years, Europe was in darkness. Yeah, you attribute great quality for the Greek thought, which is undoubtedly of very high order. But when was that? It was something like the 4th and 5th century prior to Jesus, 500 to 300 AD. The classical period of the Greek history is 500 to 300 BC. And you see that the contribution happens in spurts across the world, all societies. I can't help to focus attention on this. This is not from the book which we are referring to, but it is relevant to discuss this, I feel. The classical period of the Greece is considered to be 500 to 300 BC. That is when Socrates was there, Pericles was there, Plato was there, Aristotle was there, and many other statesmen were there. And during this period, they contributed on several domains. In fact, almost all domains of human activity: art, architecture, sports, politics, and any other activity you mention, they have done that. That is called the classical period, or the golden period of the Greek history. Has given us the great monuments, art, philosophy, architecture, literature, which are the building blocks of our own civilization. An expedition sent by, prior to this, something happened. It is very interesting to see that all this contribution was done primarily by a city-state called Athens. You may call it Greek. Of course, it might have touched out, spilled over to many other city-states as well. But the primary activity happened around Athens. And this period is soon after something very significant experience for Athenians. It was a city-state, and its population may be about 2 lakhs at that time in Athens. It was a city-state, like Sparta was another city-state. And they were very confident, they were very open, they were thought leaders of the whole of Europe at that time. Just around 500 BC, something happened. There was an empire in Persia, very large empire. Persia is today's Iraq, Iran, that area. And Emperor Darius, I think his pronunciation is Darius, Persian King Darius, he invaded Athens to punish them. It is a punitive invasion. And he landed on the coast of Marathon. Marathon is the place where there was a huge plain, and that is where the battle took place. Marathon, just 26 miles from Athens, on a punitive expedition upon Athens. This was 498 BC. The Athenians decided to face the Persian invasion at Marathon, and they prepared. Every able-bodied man in Athens went to war. And they fought. They were vastly outnumbered. In fact, they sought the help of other city-states, and Sparta agreed to send support. But they said that, okay, today to start marching towards Marathon, it is not an auspicious day. We'll start after the full moon, something like that. So they delayed it by a day or so. And by the time they reached Marathon, the war was over. It was fought by Athenians without the help of Sparta, but they defeated the Persian king Darius with his huge army. Crestfallen, the emperor withdrew. And it is on this occasion that a herald means a runner, who will come and announce the news. So his name was Phidippides. After the victory, he carried this news back to Athens. He came running for 26 miles and then announced the victory in the marketplace and collapsed and died. That is why in the Olympics there is a race called marathon race, 26 miles it is. Okay. Now, the emperor had withdrawn, but the Athenians were well aware that the emperor would come back with a larger army, better prepared, and will avenge the loss or the defeat that he has suffered in Marathon. So they prepared for 10 years. And soon after that, the emperor died and his son collected a huge army as well as his navy and surrounded Athens. Emperor Xerxes, the son of Darius, attacked Athens both on land and on sea. So the Greek, that is the Athenians, strategized, and first they withdrew from Athens into an island. Of course, before that they consulted the oracle of Delphi and took guidance from the oracle. Oracle means a priest who will get into a trance and give them guidance. They took that guidance, withdrew into an island, defeated the navy. 200 Persian ships were destroyed in the war, and then countered Xerxes on the land and defeated him also. Following this victory, the Greek classical period started. In fact, Bertrand Russell, in his book, The History of Western Philosophy, narrates this and says, how is that the Greece has produced all these excellences in so many domains in such a short time, in a very limited confinement of geography, such a small population? It did so excellently well in every field they touched. Then he termed it as the exuberance of victory against Persia. The victory has outflowed, exuberated, and then manifested in the form of creativity. He says, in all history, nothing is so surprising or so difficult to account for as the sudden rise of civilization in Greece. What they achieved in art and literature is familiar to everybody, but what they did in the purely intellectual realm is even more exceptional. They invented mathematics and science and philosophy. They first wrote history as opposed to mere annals. They speculated freely about the nature of the world and the ends of life without being bound in the fetters of any inherited orthodoxy. What occurred was so astonishing that until very recent times, men were content to gape and talk mystically about the Greek genius. I would juxtapose this statement against what Professor Playfair has commented on India. I would say that, okay, Greek has demonstrated all this. The Greece has demonstrated all this. For a period of 200 years, there was this exuberance. But after that, nothing. Can we say this today? Could Greece reproduce this ever? I would refer you to an autobiographical book by a Kannada author by name S.L. Bhairappa. The book's name is Bhitti. It's an autobiographical narration, Bhitti, in which he narrates, he said he went to Greece, he went to Athens, visited the museum, and he talked to the curator of the museum and asked this question. He said, Greece has produced all these then. Such a great, wonderful, wonderful statues, very live, very beautiful, wonderful architecture, and great philosophy. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pericles, this kind of people. And great in sports, great in warfare, great in everything that they did, but for 200 years. Why is that the Greece was not able to replicate this in the last 2000 years? The curator gave him an answer, but the answer was that after we accepted Christianity, it was a straitjacket worldview and it scorched our creativity. Yeah, the point I am trying to make is that no society can boast of things of excellence all the time. Now, another example I would like to cite is that the Industrial Revolution, which happened in Europe. In Europe, it did not happen everywhere. It happened in England. And in England also, it did not happen everywhere. It did not happen in London. It happened in Manchester. There were several mills, industry, predominantly textile mills in Manchester. And during the period, what we call as Industrial Revolution, which is a period of something like 70 years, 1760 to 1830. During this period, something very unique, something that is not replicable, cannot be repeated, has not been repeated, that has happened during this period of 70 years. Something like 250 different innovations, engineering innovations, as well as technological innovations happened during this period, reducing the back-breaking work upon the laborer, mechanizing things, improving the industry, and by improving the industry, their not only production system, their trade, their commerce, their several other things have improved. It put tremendous power in the hands of British and also other European colonies were surrounding Britain. And the European countries expanded their influence across the globe. They extended their colonies, and England, of course, extended it upon India. They built an empire where the sun would never set. But this happened in 1760 to 1830, but it did not repeat again in Europe. So if Professor Playfair says that India was not original during the period when he was examining it, it does not mean that India was not original earlier. If it is not original earlier, how could they produce all that? Okay, and nor is it unique for Britain to show. Britain, see, look at the period when Playfair was talking. It was 1792. Look at the period when all these people, several quotations which I gave, were talking. It was around 1800. That was a time of a glorious period for England. That was the time of the Industrial Revolution. That is the time of their expansion. That was the time of their high energy. There was an exuberance happening there. But the Britain could not replicate it later. Today, certainly it is not able to replicate. Today, see, that was the time when Britain was considered the #1 country in the world. But this primacy lasted only for a century more. By the beginning of the 20th century, during the First World War, it became clear that Britain is no more the world leader. That leadership went to America. And Britain has never retrieved it again. Therefore, we need to understand that this kind of energy, if you have to tap it, you have to tap a different source. Yeah. Now the conclusions. There are many philosophical formulations. This is the theory of atrophy. Atrophy means something that is useless will fall off. If you are not using your hand for the purpose it is intended to, the hand will fall off. That's what it means. Therefore, there is a theory that the Indian society, this especially Marx formulated it very succinctly, very clearly, that India is a stagnating society and it is bound to be broken. That was his theory. In 1853, he wrote 2 articles in the New York Herald Tribune or some paper, in which he said that Indian society is a stagnating society. It needs to be broken up. And the Britain is an unconscious tool of history in causing this breakage. He said Britain is doing good for India because it is breaking its stagnant society, so that some revolution, some improvement will happen in India. So that theory. There are many philosophical formulations regarding the growth and decline of human societies, or the various stages which they are supposed to pass through. This is a Marxian formulation that it has to move from primitive socialism to then feudalism, feudalism to democracy, capitalism, capitalism to socialism, etc. The theory of atrophy, as usually applied to India, is one of them. It is possible that it also has some relevance in explaining the growth, flowering, and decline of Indian society. Though the contemporary data, as separate from opinions and formulations, does not seem to indicate that the 18th century sciences and technologies in India had atrophied. Some of them may well have been in such a state, but not everything. Dharmapalji says that this cannot be. The data doesn't show that. Opinions may be. Usually the Marxist approach is that they hoist their theory upon the data, not formulate based on the data. So here Dharmapalji says that look at the data, you need not accept this opinion. Goes further. Whatever may be the actual relevance of the theory of atrophy or other theories of European origin in explaining the development of Indian society, it appears much more probable that in most respects, the sciences and technologies of India had reached a desirable balance and equilibrium much before the 18th century. In the context of the values and aptitudes of Indian culture and social norms and the consequent political structure and institutions, the sciences and technologies of India, instead of being in a state of atrophy, were in actuality usefully performing the tasks desired by Indian society. Whatever was sought by Indian society, they were doing it. They are fulfilling the purpose for which they were developed. It is the application of unrelated standards and judgments, particularly those emanating from 18th and 19th century Europe, which hide and distort the actual situation and relationship. You should note that the Indian paradigm, Indian purpose of life is not a continuous economical development. Whereas a Marxian paradigm would say any development means it is economic development. India has a different way of looking at life, and where it would look for adequate economic development, but there are higher purposes of life. And what Sri Dharmapalji says here is that The science and technology and other institutions of India were fulfilling the task for which they are intended to be. It may not be the same purpose which Europe is viewing as of paramount importance. It is different. It is in such a context that a man like Voltaire considered India famous for its laws and sciences and deplored the mounting European preoccupation of those in India with the amassing of immense fortunes. What did Europeans do? What did England do? It amassed immense wealth and shifted it to England in a very, very systematic way. The taxes were increased beyond all reasonable measure, because of which the entire agriculture of India started suffering on the decline. Vast stretches of lands were left uncultivated. Yeah. So Voltaire says, this quest for riches intensified the struggles, plunder, etc. during his own time, that is Voltaire's own time. Voltaire's time in the French Revolution time. 1789 was the French Revolution. And made him remark that if the Indians had remained unknown to the Tartars and to us, Tartars means all this, the Mughals and Pathans and those people, and to us, that is Europeans, they would have been the happiest people in the world. Very unfortunate is that these people came to know of India and India's wealth, and then we became victims of their attack. Voltaire recognized that. Dharmapalji says, remarks, observations, threats, and declamations, like those quoted above, I'm talking about Macaulay, Wilberforce, Playfair, and the like, have shaped all the writing and teaching about India, and more or less continue to do so in the manner and direction indicated by Macaulay and by his more powerful precursors like William Wilberforce and James Mill. Wilberforce, I have quoted 1813. Macaulay was 1835. James Mill wrote the British history of British India. It was the first history book written by the Britishers. It was published in 1817. It was a textbook for the ICS officers for a long time. All of them held very low opinion of India, Indian society, its culture and civilization. And they will continue to do so. What the Macaulay's offsprings continue to do were augmented by the Marxist offsprings, you should say, the Marxian theoreticians, historians, and the like. So the combination became very lethal for India. The doubts and declamations of Playfair, Laplace, Macaulay, etc., however, are not the sole causes of this ignorance and apathy. These seem to arise partly from much deeper issues which pertain to the conflicting hypotheses about state and society. What is the purpose of a state? India has a particular viewpoint on that. It comes from the paradigm, from the purpose of life. Europe has a different perception of that. These differences could not be balanced, could not be adjusted. European perception is different, Indian perception is different. India was living in a particular way, but now the European ideas are hoisted upon that. Even after 1947, We did not revise, review, and connect to the roots of our own country and culture. He says these declamations of Playfair and Macaulay, etc., is a superficial issue. The real issue is paradigmical. The 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries European view of society and thus of science, technology, and politics, etc., was diametrically at variance with the views about them held by non-European societies during the same period. You say non-European, especially Indian. The sciences and technologies of the non-European world also had different seekings and developments to those of Europe. Further, in countries like India, their organization was in tune with their more decentralist politics. See, the Indian way of, when I say politics, it is not in the superficial sense of the word. Politics means the manner in which a society seeks to resolve its own problems, its own problem of governance, not only the political government, not only making laws, but also governance of its education system, for example, how its social organization should be, how the state should be responsible to the citizen. All these comes under politics. In that sense, Indian organization, Indian political system, the societal system and the political system within that was a decentralized system. There were village entities. Villages would perform for all practical purposes. 90% of their political needs are decided and looked after, addressed by the local bodies. Tax is collected, but a large portion of the tax, say 80% of the tax, remains with the village. Only 20% goes to the king. The king was a monarch, but the local arrangement of the panchayat, it is called panchayat, headed by 5 people of the village. May not be exactly 5, but then a panchayat. The panchayat will decide how this money is to be spent on the education of the children, on the temples, on the roads, on the water bunts, on the police system, on the judicial system. All these aspects of polity are addressed locally, organized locally. The centralized approach is not Indian. It is, if you look at the education system, you would find that every village had a school. And it is the panchayat which would pay the school teacher. And if the teacher is not performing, it immediately comes to the knowledge of the panchayat. The centralized system is a Western model which has been hoisted in India. The judicial system, for example, if there is a contest between 2 neighbors, it will be taken to the panchayat and the panchayat will meet and dissolve it in a day. Resolve the whole problem. And if a party is not satisfied, then of course he can escalate it to higher level. And there are 5 different levels. And the final thing is that of the king. He can go up to that, but only if he is not satisfied. But the first level of legal dispensation was free. Whereas the centralized system of judicial system today, which we are observing today, has millions of cases pending. Yeah. So the centralist approach is not Indian. It is a decentralized approach. With their more decentralist politics, and there was no seeking to make their tools and workplaces unnecessarily gigantic and grandiose. You are not addressing the whole world. It is not huge industry, huge factories, no. It is small, gharelu industry it was. Smallness and simplicity of construction, as of the iron and steel furnaces or of the drill plows, was in fact due to social and political maturity, as well as arising from understanding of the principles and processes involved. Instead of being crude, the processes and tools of 18th century India appear to have developed from a great deal of sophistication in theory and a heightened sense of the aesthetic. A cosmic vision, a global vision, but a local action. This is the distinction of India. However, it has decayed over the last 2 centuries. So Dharmapalji lists the reasons for the decay. Why have sciences and technologies, which seem to have been very much alive about 8 to 10 generations ago, been wholly eclipsed? He lists 3 major points. The economic breakdown of India during 1750 to 1900, 1.5 centuries. The backbone of Indian farmer was broken. There was a great decay economically. The moment economy suffers, every other aspect of the polity also suffers, because it is not watered there. Education system failed because of that. And because the education system failed, today also we continue with the Western model of education. The contrary nature of the new state fiscal system, when compared with the indigenous budgeting of state revenues, left the overwhelming proportion of revenues at the local levels. I mentioned that a major portion of the tax collected remains in the village and is expended by the villagers themselves. So this decentralization makes people more responsible and it attends to the local needs. The needs of different villages can be different, but it is locally decided. 3, studied neglect and contempt by the rulers. This to my mind completed the uprooting and elimination of indigenous sciences and technologies, not only from society, but from Indian memory itself. Today we don't even remember, we don't even recall that such a thing existed. And that is why he wrote the book. And he said that in post-independence, what did we do? We grafted the Western model into our society. It is not working, he says. What has developed in India in the field of science and technology during the past century, and at a greater pace since 1947, please note this. What the British started, the independent India adopted in full, is mainly a transplanting of some of that which has developed during this period in the European world. Such a transplanting has happened not only at the level of theories, but even more so as regards the organization of technology and the direction of research. It is largely due to such transplanting and its unthinking acceptance that though many individual Indian scientists and technologists are as creative and inventive as their colleagues in the European world, the impact of this science and technology on the larger society of India is in fact minimal. The problem of India today is how to achieve and increase such innovation and creativity. Such innovation and creativity can arise, however, only from a widespread indigenous base. He says the society should respond, society should understand what to do. Society should be free to do, experiment, and find its own roots so that it can flower its genius. It requires a widespread indigenous base. Such a base has yet to be identified, and the superstructure accordingly modified and linked with it in countries like India. For that, knowledge and comprehension of how they functioned before the beginning of this dominance seem to be essential. I mean, this is why we should study history. Even for the purposeful adaptations from European, or for that matter, Japanese or Chinese or any other, science and technology, and their integration with indigenous concepts, knowledge and forms, concepts, knowledge and forms. It is necessary that these countries such as India achieve such self-knowledge and understanding at the earliest possible. That is it. So I have tried to bring the thought of Sri Dharampal, a very great Indian, a very great historian, his thoughts on science and technology of India on the 18th century. He has also written on the polity of India, which we shall see in future sessions, and also on the education system, that also we will see in future. What was the education system prevalent in India before the advent of the British, and how it collapsed during 19th century.
Fine, sir. Thank you very much, sir, for this session. So now we have you. Yes, sir. You have something to say?
One point, this part I had not completed during the second session. Second part of presentation, I have 3 files, I'll just present that.
Fine, sir.
Yeah. This is on the relationship between the science and spirituality in India. When I say science, it is not merely science, it is the temporal learning, the worldly learning, and spirituality, how they are coordinated. In the West, I mean, this is in the background of the West. Western experience is that the papacy ruled Europe for about 1,000 years. And Europe, it is classified as a dark age. Their energies did not bloom. It is only when Europe threw away the yoke of papacy, of religion in the West, that creativity started flourishing there. The Renaissance occurred, and our scientific revolution, and all these revolutions occurred after the society broke away from papacy. So this conflict in Europe, in fact, the final culmination of all that is the Marx coming and saying that all religion is a booze, an opium to the masses. That is the extreme viewpoints in Europe. But in India, it has never been like that. In India, both the temporal sciences, the worldly sciences or worldly learning, and spirituality, they coexisted. They complemented each other. They did not contradict each other. I'll give you 2 quotations, one from the Upanishad per se, and another from Aryabhatiya, the most prominent among our mathematicians and scientists. In the Upanishad, this is the Mundaka Upanishad. In the Mundaka Upanishad, the beginning, Guru Angirasa and Shishya Shaunaka. Shaunaka was a householder learned, respected in the society. Angirasa is a rishi. So Shaunaka approaches his guru, Angirasa, and then asks this question, prostrates before him, very humbly, he asks this question. Kasmin bhagavo vijnate sarvamidam vijnatam bhavati iti. He addresses his guru as Bhagava. Kasmin bhagavo vijnate. By knowing which all this becomes known. All else becomes known. Sarvamidam vijnatam bhavati iti. By knowing which science, which knowledge, which discipline, can I know everything? That's his question. And Guru Angiras replies, there are two types of knowledge. He says, Dve vidye veditavye iti hasma yad brahma vido vadanti. He says that the learned people, the knower of Brahman, the sages, he's not talking about a temporal person. He's talking about a Brahmavida who knows this as well as that. He knows everything. Such people have classified knowledge into two categories. Dve vidye veditavye iti hasma yad brahmavido vadanti. Para chaiva aparacha. One is paravidya, another is called aparavidya. Then he goes on to say, Tatra apara Rigvedo Yajurveda Samavedo Atharvaveda Shiksha Kalpo Vyakaranam Niruktam Chando Jyotishyam Iti. What are the Aparavidya? He says, Aparavidya is Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharvaveda. Then the 6 Vedangas, Shiksha, Kalpa, Vyakarana, Nirukta, Chandas, Jyotishyam. These are called Vedangas. The 4 Vedas and the 6 Vedangas, all of them are Aparavidya. Then what is Paravidya? Atha para yaya tad aksharam adhigamyate. That part, that knowledge, that section which helps you to understand Brahman, that is called Paravidya. That part actually comes from the Vedas only, but it is a very small portion of the Veda called the Upanishad. That is Paravidya, he says. But the rest of the Veda, Traigunya Vidaya Vishayo Veda. Bhagavad Gita says Traigunya Vishayo Veda. Traigunya means Sattva, Raja, Tama. That means it belongs to the Prakriti, this life, the worldly life. So Rigveda, Yajurveda, Samaveda, Atharvaveda contains Upanishad, but the bulk of that is actually pertaining to this world, and that is called Aparavidya, the one which allows you to go or takes you further to reach Brahman, that is called Paravidya. Both coexist. There is no conflict between the two. The same Upanishad continues to say, it gives a metaphor. He says, there are 2 birds in the same tree. Dva Suparna, the beautiful plumage. Dva Suparna Sayuja Sakhaya. They are united in friendship. Sayuja, Sakhaya. Samanam Vriksham Parishashvajate. They live in the same tree of life. One of them, Tayor Anya Pippalam Swadavat. One tastes the fruits available in the various branches of the tree, and the other one is perching above on the top of the tree, silently watching, witnessing, without chirping, without eating. Tayor Anya Pippalam Swadavat Anashnan Anyo Abhichaka Shiti. The other one, Anashnan, it is not eating. Abhichaka Shiti, it is witnessing everything, but not doing anything. Now the lower bird, which is actually tasting the fruits, hops from one branch to another. because it is not satisfied by this fruit or that, and then keeps on moving from branch to branch and eventually spirals upwards. You should take care to spiral upwards. If it spirals upwards and then eventually reaches the top, and then it realizes that there is other bird which is very similar to itself in look, in appearance, but then it is the master. And when he looks at them, it reminds of its own glory. It is reminded of its own glory and then gets united with the other bird. What does this mean? It means that the bird in the lower branches is tasting fruit, experimenting, learning, moving through life, and eventually spiraling upwards, becoming more and more mature, reaches the top, and then it sees the other bird. That is the realization that it gets. That is called the Paravidya. So the Aparavidya is the secular knowledge, and all secular knowledge, they are not deprived. The higher bird doesn't say that you should not do it. It merely watches. It allows you to do. It allows you to taste. So there is no conflict. The spirituality has no conflict with the secular sciences. It allows you to continue because all secular knowledge ultimately leads you to spirituality. That is from the spirituality angle. Now this is the invocation at the beginning of Aryabhatiya, the opening sentence of Aryabhatiya, where he offers prayer to the Brahman, to spirituality. Says Aryabhata, having paid obeisance to Brahman, okay, pranipatyaika anekam ka satyam devatam param brahmam Aryabhati strini gadati ganitam kalakriyam golam. He says, having paid obeisance to Brahman, who is the one in causality, but many in manifestation, the true deity, Satyam Devatam, says, true deity, the supreme spirit, Param Brahma. Aryabhata sets forth three things: Ganita, Kalakriya, and Gola. A preeminent scientist pays obeisance to Brahman. This is how India was. So there was no conflict between the secular knowledge and secular outlook and the spiritual knowledge and spiritual outlook. Both of them looked at each other as complementary disciplines. That is the Indian viewpoint. And therefore, we need to look at reconstruction of India has to take into account this outlook. It is not science and technology for science and technology itself. It is not a materialistic outlook. It is a spiritualistic outlook which will cause India to rise. Yes, that is the end.
Okay,
Thank you for your
thank you.
patience. If there are any questions, I would like to hear them.
Yeah, so before we have the question and answer, we have a few concluding remarks by Nikhil Rao. Nikhil, I request you to come on audio, please.
Yeah, fine.
Namaskar. A few additional concluding comments. Today, we hear people all over the world saying that, in general, we find Indians are very intelligent. And it is not, they are not saying this because the rest of the world there are no intelligent people, or even because we can say that everyone from India is intelligent. But it is because over the centuries, we have seen so many brilliant mathematicians, astronomers, and scientists, as we have seen in this whole series of Indian scientific heritage. And in general, we can also see that even today, the number of very brilliant people who are coming from India are significantly higher in their numbers compared to the rest of the world. So we can ask the question, how is this that why are we like that, and why Indians are so intelligent? So the answer to that is very, very simple. The answer is it lies in our genetic lineage and of course our culture. Over centuries, people in India have pursued so many problems in astronomy, mathematics, and we must not leave out philosophy, arts, music, dance, painting, sculpture, pottery, and the list is endless. So many problems were looked at and pursued. Because of this, our ancestors developed tremendous cognitive and analytical abilities. And the most important thing is that they have passed it on to us. Even if brain and body forgets as we age, our genes will always remember. So if anyone and if we have to credit anyone for our abilities, we must credit our ancestors for it. And of course, their incessant and never-ending pursuit to acquire more knowledge in so many diverse fields. So this pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of knowing things in so many diverse fields, today we have described this in one word and we are calling that Jignasa. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you, Nikhil, for those concluding remarks. Now we will open the session for Q&A. So first question by Nagi, please.
Yeah, namaste, sir.
Namaste.
I really want to thank you for a fantastic, absolutely superb talk comparison today. In fact, Nikhil just said, he said it's come in the genes and we owe it to our ancestors. But I really want to say that whatever change is happening in me, at least, I really owe it to you. Okay. So this fantastic series of talks is something that has really opened up. And the pitiable thing is, I think if our generation, that is, I am 60 plus now, okay, like many of us in the group. So if our generation has lost this to take this further, because we actually, many of us, we sent our children to US to study and saying that everything, life is there, go study there and come back. So how much, I mean, I didn't know many of this after I came to Jignasa only. Sort of, I've been reading up Bhagavad Gita quite a lot. I think not everyone is like that, but I'm really struggling to understand what can be changed for this movement to start at a much younger level is something that I'm really struggling. Okay, so just want to share that thought.
I do not have a ready-made answer to the question what can be initiated. Various thoughts are being discussed. Various propositions have come. Prakash ji also proposed something. We should do it, but we need to become more competent in our field. This is non-negotiable. The fundamental aspect is that we need to know. And if we know, our children will know.
Exactly.
The very essential thing is that it is an existential manner in which the children learn from their parents. You don't have to preach. If you know it, it will get transferred to them. So it is very, very essential that we need to know. See, we are a group of some 200 people now, but then we should internalize this. That goes without saying. We can expand, we need to expand, we need to become a larger, our reach should be increased, and our activities also need to increase, but then it requires several people to do it. But non-negotiable part is that all of us need to be more competent.
Competent, yeah.
And start reading, presenting, learning, sharing, this has to continue. This is children pick it up very well. There is nothing wrong in going out and studying things, but at home, if the parents are loyal to their culture, children also will be. That is fundamental. That part is non-negotiable, I feel.
Yeah. No, culture part, I understand. I mean, that is something it definitely needs to be there. But what I was talking was, in fact, Dharmpal clearly stated in one of his foils that such a past existed. It itself is not known to many because it has been totally eliminated from our history. Okay. So since independence, that opportunity was lost. So that's something I think we need to bring it back somehow.
That is right. You see, Dharampal also started in as a loner. He was a one man, but then subsequently there is a center started. Then these people like Claude Alvarez and other people joined hands. There is a center in Chennai by name Center for Policy Studies. They have a website. They have published several books. They keep doing this work very diligently. It is headed by two scholars. One is Dr. Jitendra Bajaj, another is Dr. M.D. Srinivas. They have brought out so many books related to this, not only Dharmapal, but related to these ideas. So the activities of that kind will have to grow. It will always grow slowly. It doesn't happen overnight. But we need to be active, that is for sure.
Thank you, sir.
See, 200 people is not a small number. If we can do it, even 200 people. We started as a group of 10. It has become 200 now. So now it is not a small number. But it is necessary that we understand it diligently, clearly. It is not enough if you have become emotional and say that, okay, we had ancestors who did all this. It is not enough. See, look at Playfair's comment. He says that your ancestors have done it, but you have not done it.
Done it, correct.
That is a truth, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
But I can counter it saying, okay, no society has served this all the time. Neither England has done it, nor Greece has done it. So why do you complain against India? But that is no excuse to say that we will not revive ourselves, right? We need to do that. And we need to identify what will revive us. We should not, see, the Greece could not revive itself. It went into a spiritual, I mean, in a religious direction, it went into a different direction and it is not able to revive. But it is not the case in India. See, the Indian revival will happen with spirituality. If you study Sri Ramakrishna Paramahamsa, see, Sri Ramakrishna was born at a period which was the darkest period in Indian history. I say darkest because the 19th century was the worst period for India. I am really hopeful and say that our worst is over. The 19th century was the worst period. That was the time when the entire country was under foreign rule. And that was the time when India started losing confidence. It was a time, see, after the 1857 war, which we lost, and as a consequence, India lost in confidence. It was a very few lone voices which surfaced again. Vasudeva Badavanta Phadke, Chapekar brothers, Savarkar, these kind of people, of course, they kept the fire glowing, the lamp lighted, but the whole society, was in a state of shock. It went under. It took a very long time to revive from there. But the real revival happened through spirituality. It was It was Sri Ramakrishna who produced people like Vivekananda, and it is Vivekananda who did something far more visible, far more visible. But if you ask Vivekananda, he will say, my guru can produce people like me. It is not I who have done it. And Sri Aurobindo says, he has said, he has written that after Sri Ramakrishna started his sadhana, things in India started changing. This is a yogi's word.
Mhm.
So I believe that India knows how to revive itself. India knows, and the key lies in spirituality. And all temporal sciences and other things will draw from spirituality. In our tradition, it is called Rajavidya. Bhagavad Gita says Rajavidya. 9th chapter, Rajavidya, Rajaguhya Yoga, it says. Upanishads also say that spirituality is the fundamental knowledge. As I have quoted this Dvevidya,
Mhm.
the Brahma Vidya is said to be the Sarva Vidya Pratishtha. So that has to be revived. And what is revival? Revival is knowing it is revival. India has to focus on that. So it is true that what Dharmapalji said about 18th century is not known. If it has to be known widespread, the government has to do it.
Yeah.
We can do it, we are doing it. The government has to do it so that it happens in a larger scale across the society. It has to be included in part of our curriculum.
Exactly.
There should be pointers to study these things. So without which the whole society will not come to know. It will be isolated individual cases, 10 people, 20 people, 200 people like that. The whole society need to know. So all this will happen as the awareness grows. If the government doesn't do it, what do you do? First, you have to change the government. So you have to work from the grassroots level only in that case. It is said that yatha raja tatha praja.
Okay.
But then if the Raja misbehaves, it becomes incumbent on the Praja to remove him and put somebody else. So the governments need to function as per the requirement dictated by the society. So the society has to take it upon itself to change those government and make it, implement it in a larger scale. I mean, that is a path. That is a path. But I am not despondent at all. I feel very, very sure that our worst is over. Our worst was 19th century. And during the last century, that is the 20th century, we have been steadily making progress. Yeah. Now the 20th century, it has become more manifest. Today, if you see in the internet world, if you see, there are so many people are working in this direction. So many. We need to coordinate, yes. Ravi Prakash ji mentioned that. Why not we coordinate with them? Yes, it's a very valid point. Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Fine, sir. So we'll go to the next question now. Satyabodha had a question, but looks like he dropped out.
Yeah.
Satyabodha?
No, I am there actually.
Yes, please.
Is the other Satyabodha.
Okay, there are two Satyabodha in the group now. Now I am calling from Muscat, Oman.
Okay.
When I see this Greeks history, it's very true that once they took over this Christianity, so immediately the invention, the scientific heritage, everything gone on to a task. Similarly, since I am here in GCC in the Middle East and Muslim world, I think there are no, except very few like our Abdul Kalam or this, that. So this community and these countries never produced any big scientist or no this one, no, in the entire world. Of course, Iran did something during Persia when they were Persians. After they also took Islam, I think it almost got disseminated. So in other words, my question is, all these, whether Christianity or this Islam, so these religions never allowed anyone to come up, or at least to continue their scientific or mathematics or philosophical churn.
Yeah, Semitic paradigm is like that. Semitic paradigm doesn't tolerate other outlooks. It can't assimilate paradigm. Individuals are there who have stepped out of that and stood, they have assimilated. But there are very few lone individuals who have done that. Our own Abdul Kalam was one a very noble example, but then he stepped out of that paradigm. I don't think he was in that paradigm. When I'm saying paradigm, I'm not talking about holding a prayer in a particular manner. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying in the paradigm, which we have discussed quite elaborately, that the paradigm doesn't allow independent thought on that. It is a belief-oriented paradigm. You look at the list of Nobel laureates last 100 years, you will see that.
Okay, धन्यवाद.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. There is one more question from Satyabodha Kulkarni. Kulkarni, sir, please.
So
Today is
one
Satyabodha Day. Yeah.
second Satyabodha fall behind. Sir, namaste, sir. I was just speculating. See, there was a spurt of creativity, and then there was this. There lot of invasions. Mughals came, and then it was East India Company. Maybe this is just a wild thought that people were more intended to, rather they were concentrating on their survival rather than learning. They were more inclined to learn what is required for sustenance than creativity. Then and maybe now also we find that what we learn is only for rather survival or sustenance. ಹೊಟ್ಟೆ ಪಾಡಿಗೆ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತೀವಲ್ಲ ಸರ್ ನಾವು, ಅಂದ್ರೆ ನಾವು ಕಲಿಯೋದು ನಮ್ಮ ಜಾಬಿಗೆ ಅಥವಾ ಇದಕ್ಕಾಗಿ ಅನುಕೂಲ ಆಗುವಂಥದ್ದು ಮಾತ್ರ ನಾವು ಕಲಿತೇವೆ. ಹಾಗೆ is it because of that survival against say the rule, or maybe for sustenance living, was that the reason for the low profile of India in creativity in that period?
Yeah. See, when invasions happen, the first instinct is survival, isn't it? When somebody is ruling over you, somebody is actually sitting over your chest and pressing your neck. Your thought will always be concentrated on how to get your next breath. So it is very natural for a society to think of survival when the alien rulers are sitting on your neck. It is very, very natural. That is one point. Second point is that the last 1,000 years is not a very glorious period for India compared to what it achieved earlier. As I have shown you the list, see, the last 400-500 years when Europe was active, India was not active in creativity, in science, in this thing. It was not the best period for us. Because we were engaged in a life and death battle as society. So it is very natural, the instincts are focused around the survival. And in the last 200 years, during the British rule, India went into an abyss of poverty. Famines were unknown in India before the 19th century. Unknown. You see, today India, today we are free, and you see, in the last 8-10 months, the government itself arranged for food for the society, almost the entire society. 80 crore population were fed for about 8 months. Is it not wealth? It is wealth. So India never knew this poverty which we saw in the 19th century. Before 19th century, there were no famines in India. But there were some 4 or 5 different famines during the 19th century. And it went down. The poverty was the order of the day. I remember my grandfather with a family of 7 people He had a salary of 17 rupees per month. I mean, the times were different, but then it was poverty only. So this was very normal for Indian society at the time of freedom. 1947, 50s, you still see widespread poverty in Indian society. Today it is not so. In spite of the fact that many corrupt politicians have looted the country, India is still rich today. It is very confident of itself today. But the British had done much more than that. It not only looted what was available, but they took away the initiative. They broke the backbone of Indian farmer. It was a matter of strategy for them to do that, because only a society which is reduced to serfdom will not be able to revolt. If you allow them to be educated, leadership will emerge. If you allow them to be rich, there can be revolts. So grind them to poverty. This is a strategy. So naturally, we are conditioned for that for about 1.5 to 2 centuries. So naturally, Indian society looks after that. First things see is that where can I get some more money? So now that phase is over. Now I think we are far more confident of ourselves.
Even Dharampal says that free the people, they will become more creative.
Yeah. Only when your stomach is full, you can become creative, right?
Yes.
So Swami Vivekananda said, he said, the greatness of India is its spirituality, he said. But then you cannot preach spirituality to a hungry person.
Yes.
That also he has said. So that is the first requirement. You need to eat 3 times a day. Yeah, that is the first requirement. After that, we can think of creativity and art, architecture, music, spirituality, all these things come later.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. There's one more question from Nikhil. Nikhil Rao, please.
Sir,
You can come on video if you don't mind.
oh, okay. I will start my video. Fine. Okay, namaste, sir. This is a beautiful series. It is a total eye opener for me. At least personally, I can say this is a very nice series you have compiled. Thank you very much for that. My question is actually related to so today Indian society, the paradigm that we are seeing is dominant seems to be materialistic,
Yes.
the mechanistic paradigm, and not the spiritual paradigm. And as we see, as it is told in Bhagavad Gita chapter 2 about how one develops a strong attachment to sense objects because it gives them a sort of pleasure, the pleasure we derive from that. Unfortunately, breaking this mechanistic paradigm may be a lot tougher, and bringing people back to the spiritual paradigm will be tougher. So what are your thoughts, and is there any way in which spirituality can actually come back as the dominant paradigm here?
Yeah. I think it is the purpose of jignasa.
Yes, sir, that is true.
There is no substitute for knowledge. We need to know. We need to know. If you want to break away from this paradigm and go there, you should understand what is that paradigm. What is this and what is that? That knowledge, that discrimination will help you to disengage from this and go there. It is not an easy task. It will not happen overnight. It is a slow process, but then it will happen if you take the necessary steps. There is a saying that, okay, if I need to go from A to B, which is the shortest path, provided there are multiple paths. If there is only one path, it also happens to be the shortest path. So there is no substitute for that. So knowledge, learn and spread. We need to learn. First thing is that we need to learn. We need to know more. So it should become our natural habit, natural engagement that we use all our time to learn. It is a very, very important thing. Yeah. After you learn, you make your surroundings more learned. It happens.
Okay, and then that gives opportunity to spread our knowledge to others and also bring them out of that.
Shreyan dravyamayat yajna jnana yajna parantapah. Sarvam karma akhilam partha jnane parisamapyate.
Right,
Yeah.
sir. Thank you, sir.
Very good. Very good.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Shall we end?
Fine, sir. Sir, we can conclude the session with Shanti Mantra. Thank you very much for this session, sir.
Yeah.